Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We got a lot of material in here tonight. There isn't much on your sheet, but my sheet's pretty thick. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Lord, again today we're so thankful for your goodness, for your mercy, for your grace. We're thankful, Lord, that you cover all of our needs, and when there's something that needs to be done, you're faithful to provide if we'll put our trust in you. And Lord, tonight as we enter into your word again, I pray you will anoint your word, anoint our hearts to receive, help us to understand, Lord, what you have for us, and that portion that will grow within each of us and spring forth into fruit. For these we're going to thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Is the camera
Okay.
on? The camera on?
I turned it on.
Awesome.
Last week, we covered Daniel chapter 8. And of course, chapter 8 was an interesting chapter. It has the four beasts. I'm sorry, chapter 7. It was chapter 7 last week, 8 this week. It had the four beasts that rose up out of the sea. Notice that was in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar. And these four really strange looking beasts rise up out of the sea. Oh, there's the, oh my goodness. I mean, if you look at these guys, they are spooky. The first one was like a lion, had eagle's wings. And then there was another one looked like a bear, and he had a half a rack of ribs in his mouth. You know, he come up with these rib bones, you know. And then there was the leopard with the wings of a fowl on its back, and finally they had this beast. He didn't even describe it. It was so terrible. They came up with the 10 horns, and out of the middle of that horn came a small horn that grew to be large. And of course, we understood those to be the four Gentile kingdoms that followed. Actually, it was Babylon that started, and then the three that followed it. And if you remember, we tied that to the image that Daniel saw earlier. And the image was the view of God as to the structure of these kingdoms. To God, the perfect perfect kingdom structure was Babylon. That was the perfect, that was pure gold. And if you remember our study through Isaiah, we learned that while the character himself, Nebuchadnezzar, wasn't such a benevolent person. I mean, he'd have your head, if he decided he wanted to have your head, he'd just have it. Or if he wanted you in the lion's den, then you win. So from a personal perspective, these guys were all pretty bloodthirsty, cruel type people. But the kingdom, if we look at how Nebuchadnezzar brought the best of everything he conquered and brought them into his kingdom and took their knowledge, their cultures, and tried to mix them in so that his own culture, his own empire became greater and richer through the knowledge and the infusion of all these different cultures. And he wasn't afraid to take people who were captured and exalt them and put them in high position. Daniel, a good example. I mean, he became one of the top rulers of the kingdom. So this was a perfect type of government as far as God was concerned. And then, of course, it fell to the Medes and the Persians and down to the Greeks and finally down to Rome. And as it came down, the metals became less precious because in the eyes of God, these were lesser types of government and economies, that type of thing. Well, then we looked at the four beasts last week, or last lesson rather. And these four beasts represented the attitudes of these same four kingdoms. Now, while the type of government for Babylon was very good, the attitude that God assigned to this was that of a lion. You know, I mean, hey, he wasn't afraid to stand up and say, this is the way it is. His kingdom was the lion kingdom. Everybody bowed and scraped, you know, in the world to Babylon. He didn't have a lot of uprisings that he had to run off and always put all these little brush fires. Everybody had such fear and esteem for his empire that nobody was going to cross him. And he extended the empire, and we talked about how through his plans and his strategies, He was able to conquer more than any other ruler had ever conquered. You know, those long marches we've talked about out across the desert where you bring 100,000 troops, how are you going to feed them? How are you going to take care of them? It slowed everybody down. That's why Egypt could never be the world conqueror. By the time they left Egypt and got all the way up to where everybody was, they were out of gas, you know. But Nebuchadnezzar was able, through conquering providences and setting them up as outposts, he had resupply routes already set up, so wherever he wanted to go with his armies, they were there. Well, because of his whole system, which was such a good system, everybody just behaved themselves. The same as if a lion comes into the area, you're not going to tease a lion. There's no animal in Africa that's going to go up and tease a lion. Only once. And then we talked about the Medes and the Persians, who was kind of the hibernating bear. You know, had been in hibernation. And they started off and then just kind of rested. And the Persian Empire, the Medes actually were the stronger one at first. And they captured some coastal areas, captured some things, and then the Persians came along and they captured some, and they decided to unite. The larger, the more powerful being the Mede, the less powerful being the Persians, but quickly the Persians rose to the top. And in fact, most of the time, most people call it the Persian Empire. It was really the Medo-Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persians. Well, that was the bear, and they had this ferocious appetite, like coming out of hibernation, and they just, you know, devoured anything in its path. Well, then along came that leopard, very fast, wings on its back. They just covered. It was amazing, the speed. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But it was the cunning of the leopard. You know, it was fast, very sleek. Not really held in high esteem by other animals. I mean, the leopard's a leopard. I mean, you know, they in the jungle, you know, they all respect the leopard, but it's not like the lion. A leopard's roar isn't going to bring a whole lot of trepidation to the animals. They just kind of, oh, the leopard's in the area, we better go, you know, hide somewhere till he passes. Not so with a lion. So there was an entirely different attitude here. And then, of course, this beast at the end we talked about, the Roman Empire, was absolutely atrocious in the way that its attitude towards others and other kingdoms and other peoples. They would put their garrisons in the town. They could care less whether you went along with them or wanted to join them, or they could care less about your culture. You were going to be Roman, and that was all there was to it. And if you didn't like it, they'd open the gates of the garrison and they'd come out and show you why you needed to be Roman. And that was the way they did things. Very autocratic. Boy, this is the way it's going to be. All right, so tonight, that takes us into the 8th chapter. And we're going to look at some more beasts tonight. And I think tonight, this is an interesting chapter, and it really wasn't until, actually, I'll be honest, until I was studying today, that I really got some insight that I had not previously had into what this chapter is really all about. So I want to share that with you tonight. But let's read from the beginning. Verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Uli. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and become great. All right, so let's pause right here for a minute. So here we have Daniel writing this account of what he says. Now, one thing to keep in mind that I think is very interesting, and I think I mentioned it at the beginning of our study of Daniel. Daniel wrote in pure Hebrew up until chapter 2 and verse 4. From chapter 2, verse 4, through chapter 7, he wrote in Chaldee. he now swings back starting in chapter 8 and writes again in pure Hebrew. And it's interesting, if we look at those verses in between there, he starts off giving a history from a Hebrew point of view. He's in, you know, he has been captured, he's from Judah, he's been captured, he's hauled into Babylon, and we get that in the first chapter. Starting the second chapter, he's still presenting this as a Hebrew. Starting in verse 4 of the second chapter, he starts presenting information about the Gentile nations. And so he writes in Chaldee, which is a Gentile language. And so he writes his entire account that had to do from a Gentile perspective. We looked at the, you know, the image, and then we looked now at the beast last time. These were all Gentile things. Now he starts writing in Hebrew. That's a key. We're now going to kind of switch our vision. God's taking his camera down and he's gone to another position and he's going to give us some events. The same time span, but from a different perspective. We're going to look at it from a Jewish or Hebrew perspective. So this is the first clue here that we're going to change things. Now, where was Daniel? Now this is interesting. You remember we talked a couple of lessons ago when Belshazzar, you know, when a new king took the throne in these Chaldean areas and in the Gentile areas, he generally did away with all the previous officers and brought his own officers in. This is what we do today. We elect a new president. First thing that happens, he's sworn in and everybody's out of office, basically. You know, he brings in people and has them all set up and ready to go. Well, the same thing happened to there. Now, under Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel was the chief magician. He was over all the other magicians because he was a magician and he was over all the rest of them. And so he held this high office, and this office was one that was next to the king. Anytime there was something he needed to find out, if he needed advice, this was a guy he would go to. And under him then were all the Chaldeans and the magicians and then the sorcerers and all of this sort of thing. And the scientists, you know, we look at it as saying, oh, it was all black magic stuff. No, not necessarily. It was a lot of astrology, a lot of science, alchemy, and all these were considered as magic. It was just, we lumped them all together. So you could say Daniel was the chief scientist, really, of Babylon. And so he was overall as under Nebuchadnezzar. As the next king came in, of course, he fired everybody and brought his own people in. At what point Daniel ceased to be the chief scientist, I don't know. But it appears that under Belshazzar, he did not have any office that was high in the court. Because you remember, when the handwriting on the wall came up, it was his grandmother that had to walk in and say, hey, there's a guy here named Daniel. Who's this guy? I don't know anything about him. So he had evidently lost that position. But he evidently still maintained some office within the kingdom. And it appears here that he was in the city of Shushan. Now Shushan is an interesting place. This province was bounded on the east by Persia proper, on the west by Babylonia, on the north by Media, and on the south by the Persian Gulf. This province was about half as large as Persia, not quite as large as England. It was probably conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, and in the time of Belshazzar was a subject to the Babylonian dominion. Shushan had been doubtless the capital of the kingdom of Elam, while it continued a separate kingdom and remained the capital of the province while it was under the Babylonian yoke, until it was subdued as part of the empire by Cyrus. It was then made one of the capitals of the united Medo-Persian Empire. It was when it was the capital of a province that it was visited by Daniel, and that he saw the vision there. In fact, it's quite possible that he had a home there, and lived there, and died there. In fact, if you go out on Google and Google for Shushan, it takes a little bit of effort, but you can find it. It's over in Iran. They actually have a building there that it's a shrine, but it's the tomb of Daniel. It's quite interesting. I read a little bit up on it. There is some, around the 1800s, there were some people that visited, and their account of it was really interesting because there was nothing there. The city of Sush, which is there, or the town, at that time it was just a very small town, is actually the oldest continuously populated city in the world, as far as they know. They found remnants there from as long as 4,000 years BC. So it has been, as far as they can tell, the longest inhabited, continually inhabited city in the world. And when these people around the early 1800s visited, it was mostly ruins. There was still a town there. It was inhabited, but it was a small town, mostly ruins. And then out of town, here was this, as they put it, just a red building sitting there. And in this red building, they called it the Tomb of Daniel. And the Derbyshires, the swirling derbies type people, they were commissioned, and there was a group of them that lived in that building, and their whole deal in life was to protect and maintain the Tomb of Daniel. So it's kind of interesting, whether it's the tomb or not, who knows? Who knows? But it is interesting that this was in Shushan. Shushan was the summer residence of the king, Artaxerxes, during the Medo-Persian Empire. It was also the place of the famous, how do you want to put it, Gamble of Esther, is spoken of in the Bible. That was at the palace in Shushan. So it's interesting that this is a very rich place in terms of biblical history, the city of Shushan. And that's where Daniel was. Probably he was there on a business for the king, some kind of official business. Maybe not the king proper, but it was some kind of political or economic trip that he had taken to Shushan. And so while he was there in the palace, all of a sudden he gets this dream, this vision. And he's standing on the bank of this river. Now, in the river, the way this is written, there's about 20 miles north of the city of Shushan. The river actually comes down and forks off into two forks. And in the middle of this, so it kind of forms this kind of a thing. And from the way it's written in the original Hebrew, it appears that he was standing really between two forks of the river. So not necessarily, he wasn't standing in the river with a bank on each side. It was left bank, right bank type thing. So he's actually in this little piece of land probably between the two rivers, and that's just above Shushan. That is actually a place that's there. You can go in on Google and look at it, if you want to spend time trying to find it like I did. So as Daniel's watching this, he sees this ram. And this ram is interesting. There's nothing really that stands out about this ram that sets it apart from any other ram. It's just a ram. And evidently when he first saw it, it was just a ram, and he's watching as the two horns, come out. But one horn is bigger than the other. Now it had two big horns. It had some really big horns. If you were a hunter, boy, you'd say, "Oh man, look at that one, that's the one I want." But it had these big horns. But one horn came up first, and then the other one came up, and it was bigger than the first one. So it had kind of this lopsided look to it. Well, if we go back to those four beasts in chapter 7, you'll remember in the Medo Empire, one horn was larger than the other one, which was the Persian Empire. And again, it came up last. It became the greater of the two. So what we're seeing here again is the Medo-Persian Empire. And so the original, of course with me, the first thing pops into my head is, why are we going back through this again? We just covered it. We must be looking at it from a different perspective. Why is Medo-Persia, who was first shown as a silver on an image of silver, shoulders and breastplate, breast area, silver, then as a ferocious bear coming up as a beast, and now we see him as a ram or a domesticated animal, farm animal. Strange. Well, in going through this, it finally sunk into me when I was looking at it. What we're looking at is these Gentile nations, their attitude or relationship with the nation of Israel. How did they treat the Jews? What was their attitude toward the Jew? Now, we're going to see some things here that's pretty wild, but the general thing here is, how did this empire itself, how did it treat the Jew? What was its attitude? We're now reading in Hebrew, so we're looking at it from a Jewish perspective. Now this ram pushes toward the north, the south, and the west. And it says nothing could stop it. There was no man that could deliver anybody out of its hand. And of course, my ever-observant wife said, "How does a ram have a hand?" That was a good thought. I'll have to think that one through. Now you'll have to have me researching this. You understand it? Notice he didn't go to the east. The Medo-Persian Empire did not expand to the east, over into India, Pakistan, that area. It moved north, south, and west. So if you look at the progression of the Medo-Persian Empire, it started east and moved west as it conquered all these lands. Go down into Egypt and so forth. So we see this ram pushing in that direction. On the west, the conquests embraced Babylonia, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Asia Minor. On the north, Colchis, Armenia, Iberia, and the regions around the Caspian Sea. And on the south, Palestine, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Libya. If you remember Isaiah 41:2, Scripture asks, "Who raised up the righteous man from the east?" Of course, speaking of Cyrus. Isaiah 46:11 says, "Calling a ravenous bird from the east," speaking of the Medo-Persian Empire again. So we get this idea they came from the east. Now this is all that's spoken of about this Medo-Persian Empire. Just that it was there and it acted more like a sheep or a ram toward Israel. And if you look at history, none of the Medo-Persian emperors or kings or generals really paid a lot of attention to Israel or Jerusalem. They didn't come in and burn the place down, or they just, it was there, they kind of got along with them, they put them under subjection, obviously took taxes, they were still in captivity to some degree, but there wasn't this ferociousness toward the people of Israel. So they were kind of allowed to do their own thing. Now we come to the next thing that comes on the scene. Notice he did it. This ram did according to his will and became great. That great means that he was pretty important to himself. Okay. Medo-Persian Empire became pretty important to themselves. It was self-exaltation type thing. Is really what's meant there by that word, great. Verse 5, "And as I was considering," so Daniel saw this and he was thinking about this, what's going on here, "behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power." So here's Daniel. He's looking at this scene, this nice little ram here, that's pushing away to the north and south, and he's probably wondering, what in the world is this ram doing? When all of a sudden, out of the west comes a goat. Oh, everybody gets upset when a goat comes after them, right? I mean, you know, this is really a fearful animal. Billy goats can be a pain in the neck, but I mean, you can still grab one of them, throw them down, and they're nothing, you know, they're not that. But this one had one big horn and sticking in the middle. Like a unicorn goat, I guess is what you kind of look at him, like with one horn right in the middle. And he came flying across so that he didn't even touch the earth. Now, that's a way of saying he came bounding. He came hardly touching the ground with such speed. Do you get the feeling here that Daniel puts across? That he came fast on the face of the horn and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn, and he came to the ram and had and smacked into him, ran into him. You get this feeling that this thing is really moving fast. And he has this notable horn, and he runs into that ram. Notice what it says. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. So here is this goat with one horn, moving, just flying fast, rams into this ram, runs into him, knocks him down, breaks the two horns, and stamps him, basically stamps him to death. Well, of course, we know by the progression of things, this had to be the Grecian or the Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great. And a little history, if you read up on Alexander the Great, he actually his conquests were the fastest conquests in all of history. I mean, here was this great horn out of the head of this goat was obviously Alexander the Great. This guy came to power when he was 20 years old. You know, we went 20 years old. How in the world could something like that happen? His father was off to war and was trying to conquer the Romans. The Roman province was a powerful province of that day. And in fact, it had conquered the Macedonians and had taken some of them captive, including at different times, different of the generals who were later to come up and actually, Antiochus Epiphanes being one, actually were at one time captive in the province of Rome. And so Alexander the Great's father was in the Roman province doing some battles down there, and he left his son in charge. His son at that time was really only about 16 years old. Now prior to that, which is interesting, let me go clear back, because I think we really need to get some understanding of Alexander the Great. His mother, whose name was Olympus, she of course became pregnant with Alexander. But she told everybody that she had this vision, and there was this lightning bolt that came down and sealed her womb and did all these things, and the outset of this was that the assumption was that the father of Alexander was actually Zeus, the Greek god. And so Alexander was in many circles treated as a god. Now there's some question as to whether she actually said that or actually denied that, but the actions around what she did later tends to say, yeah, this was probably her way of making sure her son would have a greater place in the kingdom than one of her husband's other wives' sons, okay? Because in those days they had all kinds of sons, and when the father passed away, the one that had the greatest, following, that was the one that usually took the throne because their followers killed the rest of them. It was a great way of selection. But anyway, so here was Alexander being born with this, this idea that he may be the son of a god. So he started off with that in the first place. At approximately the age of 13, he was placed under the tutelage of Aristotle. Now, if you know anything about Aristotle, he's considered one of the top philosophers in the world. Philosophies of Aristotle. He was a follower of Socrates, a student of Socrates, and he took some of Socrates' ideas and developed some of his own. But aside from that, he was also probably one of the best educators and brilliant man of his day in straight science and other things also. And so the king paid him to be Alexander's tutor, and in fact set up a place in one of the big temples there to their gods as a school. And so Alexander went there, and there was a group that went with him that was in the same class, if you will, as him under Aristotle. And for about 3 years, he sat under the tutelage of Aristotle. So, and it was during that time that he developed a very deep love for reading, literature, arts, thinking ahead, strategizing. It really turned this kid on as far as his abilities. At the age of 16, he took over for his father while his father was gone, and he seized the opportunity at the age of 16 to take the army and go out and actually conquer some areas for the kingdom, which of course impressed his father. And it was interesting, him and his father didn't always get along well. It's some interesting stories, and if you have a few hours to look through Josephus and the books of the Maccabees and some of them, you can get some pretty good stories out of there. But anyway, at the age of 20, his father had been killed. He took over and was then, and I won't go into all of this, but there was an empire that was down next to the Roman Empire. It was actually part of their area, and they decided to join in with the Macedonians, and they appointed him or named him to be the generalissimo, or the chief general of all the armies of that region. So it would be like going to the United Nations and saying, okay, you know, General so-and-so, you're in charge of all the armies of the United Nations. It was that kind of a relationship. And the sole purpose was to defeat the Medes and the Persians, to defeat the Persian Empire. So that was what he was named to be in charge of that endeavor at the age of 20. He died at the age of 32. So in 12 short years, he managed to take the Macedonian army and literally conquer almost the entire known world of his day. And as we've talked several times about how difficult it is to move an army of that size when you don't have airplanes and tanks, and you know, how many miles can you march in a single day out in the hot desert? He was able to take his army and literally defeat almost the entire known world. Absolutely amazing. A miraculous rise to power was Alexander the Great. Okay, this movement and by the way, he died in Sushan. It's kind of interesting. Or in Babylon, I'm sorry. He died in Babylon, actually. He was sick in Sushan. But he died in Babylon, and there's some question as to whether he was poisoned or not. However, one of the writers points out that the poisons of those days would have killed you in 2 to 3 days maximum. It took him 12 days to die. And the description of his death and his disease or whatever it was, he became unable to talk and slowly paralysis and then finally died. They are pointing, there was a big, it was back in the 90s or early 2000, there was a bunch of medical people got together and wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine, I believe, and they kind of did a autopsy on this whole thing, you know. And they came to the conclusion that he may have died of typhoid fever, because that was the way it would have acted. We don't have any medications. Would have taken about that period of time, and some of the symptoms were the same. Could also be Nile virus, or there was 3 or 4 things that they had named in it. Also, there were several other things that happened. He was very badly wounded when he was in India, which was his last crusade, was to take India. He took almost all of India. Before it was a leg wound, but it became very infected, I guess, or whatever. That may have caused some of this also. Anyway, it was quite a story. So this he-goat comes, takes over, and actually defeats the the Medo-Persians. It's the kingdom of Greece, the Macedonians. And then what happened to this kingdom is very interesting. Let's read. By the way, it mentioned he moved with choler. That means bitterness. Very bitter. And there was an event that took place during the rule of the Persians, and I'm not sure which king it was. I just saw a mention of it, and I didn't get a chance to, I wouldn't have to be ready for tonight if I'd have taken off on looking at that one. But there was a time during the rule of the Persians when they moved into Greece, and one of the Persian kings ordered that one of the sacred temples and towns in Greece be sacked and completely burned. And this set up a great deal of resentment on the part of the Greeks, the Macedonians. You know, it's kind of an unwritten law. You just didn't go in and do that unless you were really a nutcase. You know, you just didn't go in and deliberately tear down their religious structure and desecrate their temple. And you remember we talked about the ideas of some of these early peoples, well, we call them pagans, but really the religions of the pagans basically was everybody's God's fine. If you want to worship them, that's fine. I don't care who you worship. I worship this God, you can worship that God, as long as we understand they're all gods. Well, that was very prevalent, and you would assume that everybody would adhere to that and not go out of their way to destroy somebody else's gods. But they did, and so there was this real bitter feeling from the Macedonians toward the Persians. And so this is why he moves with such choler or such rage, such bitterness, is because of this event. And if there was one, there may have been others also. All right, verse 8. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. Okay? So when Alexander died at the age of 32, it threw the whole empire into this complete turmoil. His brother was declared king or ruler of the empire, but he really had no power. He was a figurehead only. There were 4 main generals that actually had the power in this empire. But they were still kind of hamstrung because they were so busy fighting and infighting that was going on between them and between the provinces that they were kind of over. And there was 40 years of real chaos in the Macedonian Empire. At the end of 40 years, it finally came to a fairly amicable resolution, and the empire was divided up into 4 parts. They still held their alliance. It was still the Macedonian Empire, but it was under 4 heads, if you will. Each one had their own section that they were over. So this is what we see here in this beast, when the notable horn, the one that was the most conspicuous, it broke off, and these 4 other conspicuous horns came up in its place. So now instead of having 1, now it's got 4 horns. So that's what happened here. Now the 4 kingdoms was the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the east, the kingdom of Pergama in Asia Minor and the Macedonian area, which took in Greece and those areas. Thus the dominions of Seleucus were in the east, those of Cassandra in the west, those of Ptolemy in the south, and those of Lysimachus in the north. So those were the generals that took over, and they ruled these 4 parts of the kingdom. Now notice verse 9. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host, and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Ooh, here's a nasty, nasty character that comes up out of this. Now, a lot of people have said this is the Antichrist, and it certainly sounds like him. It does the same things. But you'll remember when we started Revelation, we talked the first week about prophecies. I mentioned to you that prophecy often has a long-range meaning or long-range fulfillment, and then there is often a short fulfillment. And sometimes there is prophecy that is acted out in a short fulfillment type thing that really is a shadow, what we call a shadow, of those things that are going to come in the future. And that's really what we're seeing here. You can think of this as being a skit, a play that's being played out. This isn't for real. This was a bad time. But to let people know this is only a taste of what's going to come in the future. Okay. Now, let's take a close look at this. Just look at it, just glancing at it, you'd say, yeah, this must be the Antichrist. He does the same things, right? And you remember the beast that had the 10 horns, and out of the middle of the horn came the little horn. And here we have another little horn, so it must mean the same thing. Let's take a little closer inspection here. It says that this beast had 4 horns now, right? 4 horns. Out of the midst of one of the horns. So this was an outcropping. It was like the branch of an antler. Okay? Out of one of the horns comes this little horn. That becomes great. In the beast of the 4 beasts, it came out of the midst of the 10 horns. So this is something different. And it's a little horn, and a little horn merely meant this was somebody of little significance who grew to be big. And he came out of one of the horns. Well, by looking at the rest of this scripture and what it says happened, we understand that this was a character by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And good old Antiochus Epiphanes, his word means manifest or God. He was called the Illustrious. He gave himself that name, by the way. Antiochus the Illustrious. He was born in 215 BC, died in 164 BC. He ruled the Seleucid Empire from 175 BC until his death in 164. He was the king of Antiochus III, or the Great, and he was a brother of Seleucus IV, or Philopator. His original name was Mithridates, and he assumed the name Antiochus after he assumed the throne. So we're looking at a guy here that just ruled 1/4 of the Macedonian Empire. So this wasn't somebody that was a world leader type thing. Some interesting things happened. During his reign, he was Antiochus IV, by the way. And he decided that it would be nice if he had half the kingdom rather than the 1/4 of it. So he decided to go invade the south. And he was going to take that portion of Egypt and all of that. So he went down to Egypt, and while he was down there, he was defeating everything in Egypt. He was just marching across there. until it was kind of interesting. He came across this one old guy, and history tells you he was an old man from Rome. He was an old Roman statesman. And he met this old Roman statesman out in the desert of Egypt. And this old statesman looked at him, and he took a stick and he drew a circle around him. And he says, "You make up your mind. If you cross the line, if you come at me, the Roman legions from a province of Rome are going to tear you apart. And so you make your mind up now." And that's where the saying, "draw a line in the sand," came from. It's kind of interesting. And he had conquered most of Egypt to this point until he ran across this old Roman statesman. He turned his army around and he left. Well, there were some interesting things about the character, and one of them was he had a temper. So he decided that he was going to take it out on the Jews. And we'll get to that here in just a moment, but as to why it was. But this was part of the reason. He was so infuriated that he couldn't go any further and conquer all of Egypt. Now, one thing he did was he assumed some really divine epitaphs. He was the only one, at least of the Grecian kings, that ever did this. He called himself God Manifest. He means a bearer of victory, was another one of his names. But he was very eccentric and capricious, and even sometimes acted almost like he was insane. He had really strange things, some of them he did. But his contemporaries called him Epiphanes, or the Mad One, instead of Epiphanes, the Mad One. Take off on his name. That's what his contemporaries called him. They had a very low esteem for this guy. But while Antiochus was busy in Egypt, there was a rumor that was spread that he had been defeated and had been killed. And when he went down into Egypt, he had stopped in Jerusalem, and of course they were all subject to him. And so he appointed his own high priest. And I'll give you a little, I think this is very important here because we need to understand something. What was going on internally in Judah. That's why the whole 8th chapter of Daniel is here. And this is something I had never realized. This was the real gem that sparked in me today that I really had never seen. The only reason this chapter is here is because of what was going on internally in Judah. Now, in Jerusalem, you know, Moses and the law, you had a high priest. And the high priest was not a political office. It was anointed by God. It had to come from the Levites. There had to be purification. There had to be all of these things that went into the selection of a high priest. Political intervention was not at all allowed. And so over the centuries, the high priests of Israel became really revered individuals. You know, the people held them in high esteem. Even though, as we saw in the time of Jesus, you know, these guys could be real scallywags, the people still held them in high esteem because of the office that they held and the way they attained the office. Well, here he comes in and he decides that because there was this controversy going on in Jerusalem, and the controversy was between the Orthodox Jews and the Hellenistic Jews that came from Greece or had Greek influence. The difference was the Orthodox Jews believed in all the sacrifices and the law, and that everything should be done just the way that the law laid it out. The Hellenistic Jews, on the other hand, didn't feel the sacrifices were necessary. The high priest was not, you know, speaking for God. And in fact, there was some question of whether he actually believed in God. It was yeah, he's there, but you know, we don't have to follow his orders. And it was kind of a mixture of Greek mythology and Jewish history. So there was this battle going on at this time within Judah, particularly within Jerusalem, as to who was going to be the real person on the throne. Also, the high priest at this point in time, had risen to the point of being really almost the ruler of the city. So if the high priest said something, that's what was done. Again, we see that with Jesus. Even though Herod was the king, Herod was over Jerusalem, it's what the high priest said was done. He had the real influence. Herod was appointed by Rome. And so the people of Jerusalem said, "Hi, king. Oh, by the way, what should we do, high priest? Caiaphas, what did we do?" So we see this, yeah, he's the king, but here's the ruler approach. And that's the way it was then. So that's kind of the background of what was going on. And so when this rumor came out that Antiochus Epiphanes had been killed in Egypt, Jason, which was the high priest that had been disposed. Now he had a Hellenistic name. You notice Jason is not really a Hebrew name. But he was the high priest by right. And he gathered a force of 1,000 soldiers, made a surprise attack on the city of Jerusalem. And he drove the Manilius, who was the appointed high priest. Okay, I hope I'm not losing you all with all this. Drove him out of Jerusalem, and he went fleeing off towards Antioch, and it caused a riot in the town and all of that. Well, of course, when Antiochus Epiphanes heard about this, being his nature, he just lost his face, you know, in Egypt. He was irritated at that. Then he gets this message that there's a riot going on in Jerusalem, that his appointed guy had been tossed out. He became so enraged that he attacked Jerusalem and restored Manilius. And then he executed all kinds of Jews. Just execute anybody. Just let them know that I'm in charge. It was his approach. So anyway, now this all happened, and there were more things that went on. And anyway, he thought that Judah was in revolt. And so he took Jerusalem by storm, and what he did, he ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those whom they met, and to slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, killing of women and children, a slaughter of virgins and infants. In the space of 3 days, 80,000 were lost, 40,000 meeting a violent death, and the same number being sold into slavery. And this is from the book of Maccabees in the history. Now, in order to consolidate his empire and to give him the, really a strengthening of his hold over the region, he decided to side with the Hellenistic Jews. And so he did that by outlawing Jewish religious rites and traditions. So what he did, and of course he ordered the worship of Zeus, Zeus or Zeus, as the only supreme being. So this was in cahoots with the Hellenistic Jews. This was anathema, of course, to the Jews, and when they refused, Antiochus sent an army to enforce his decree. Because of the resistance to this decree, the city was destroyed, many were slaughtered, and a military Greek citadel called the Acra was established. Now, not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to force the Jews to abandon the customs of their ancestors and live no longer by the laws of God. Also to profane the temple in Jerusalem and dedicate it to Olympian Zeus, and that on Mount Gerizim to Zeus the hospitable, as the inhabitants of the place requested. They also brought into the temple things that were forbidden, so that the altar was covered with the abominable things prohibited by the law. A man could not keep the Sabbath or celebrate the traditional feasts, nor even admit that he was a Jew. At the suggestion of the citizens of Ptolemais, a decree was issued issued ordering the neighboring Greek cities to act in the same way against the Jews, obliged them to partake of the sacrifices, and put to death those who would not consent to adopt the customs of the Greek. It was obvious, therefore, that disaster impended. They have a little explain. Thus, 2 women who were arrested for having circumcised their children were publicly paraded about the city with their babies hanging at their breasts and then thrown down from the top of the city wall. Others who had assembled in nearby caves to observe the Sabbath in secret were betrayed to Philip, and all burned to death. So this was this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes. He actually came into the temple, burned and brought swine into the temple, burned the swine on the altar as sacrifices to Zeus. They stripped the temple completely of all gold, everything. The golden lampstands, table of shewbread, all of the utensils were taken out of the temple. There were some different accounts of what all went on. They went so far, I guess, as to go in and throw swine's blood all over the walls, just to desecrate the temple, absolute and complete. So that was this guy called Antiochus Epiphanes. Notice that in verse 11. Oh, yeah, in verse 10. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. This is not talking about natural stars, nor is it talking about angels. And we sometimes get this idea he's talking about the hosts of heaven. What he's talking about here, and this was a common phrase that was used to talk about God's emissaries on the earth, which would have been, of course, the Jewish nation, as we know from our study of the gospel of God, if you will. The emissaries on the earth was a Jewish nation. That was who God's revelation was given through. His direction was provided through the prophets and so forth. But there was also this idea of the hosts of heaven being the priests and those that served him in the temple. He even killed some of those and trampled them to death. He did not care that these were religious people. Now again, as I said earlier about one of his predecessors, it's really strange that they would take this course of action to completely destroy a religion when the idea of the religious thought of that day was that everybody has their own gods, and you don't want to mess with somebody else's God.
Who was the prince of the host? Who is that?
The prince of the hosts. Okay, we'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
I haven't got there yet. Okay, so he threw some of these to the ground and stamped upon them. Now, verse 11. This is a good verse. Yea, he magnified himself, even to the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Who is the prince of the hosts? If the hosts are the priests, who's the prince of the hosts?
The high priest. The high priest.
Well, it could be the high priest, but I think we even go higher than that.
God? God?
Yes. God himself. Now, I suppose if you really wanted to draw some parallels into the future, okay, and I believe this is why it's worded, you would think he would say God himself. But by talking about the prince, who is the prince that's going to come?
The Messiah.
The Messiah. And so here, this guy is so full of pride and self-importance that he magnifies himself, even to the point that he comes up against God and basically says, I'm taking over. Your religion is gone. I'm now in charge. When you think about it, that's exactly what he did. Now, it's one thing to defeat a country and take a city. It's another thing to stand in the sanctuary and say, I'm now in charge. You see, this guy had that kind of audacity. Now, and as I said about Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel would have never been delivered out of the lion's den, I don't think, not Daniel, I'm sorry, the 4 Hebrew children. The 4 Hebrew children would never have been delivered out of the fire if Nebuchadnezzar hadn't said, whose God can deliver you out of my hands? In other words, I'm bigger than God. No God can deliver. And what happened? They got delivered. And so we have this wonderful Bible story. I don't think this would have even been here, the 8th chapter, if Antiochus Epiphanes hadn't set himself in that position of saying, I'm God. Now the reason this all came about is, again, what was going on in Jerusalem. Why was God so moved that he had to have this chapter?
His truth was being compromised by the Hellenistic Jews.
Absolutely. And we're going to see this as we go through here. It's going to become much more clear to us why God did what he did when we get into the later
It's like a
chapter.
renewal that had to take place through this whole episode. A renewal had to take place through this whole episode because during this intertestamental period, before the Christ had come,
Yes.
the only true faith was starting to decay, diminish.
You're absolutely right. You're right. And we'll see this here in a few more verses. Got about, well, we started 15 minutes late, so I got 15 minutes. You don't think I watch a clock? I do. Okay. Notice what happened here. The daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. In other words, the place of God's sanctuary was cast down. It wasn't torn down. The walls weren't torn down. They were desecrated, and it was unusable. Notice verse 12. And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. And it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Now, who cast it down to the ground?
Antiochus Epiphanes. The bad guy. Antiochus Epiphanes.
Bad guy works too.
Notice the way this is written. Now, this just could be the way I'm reading it. Okay, I haven't done any great word studies on this, so don't go running out here and say, but this is the way I read this. It was not Antiochus Epiphanes that cast down truth to the ground. It was the transgression.
Well, it says in here, it says, and the host, the chosen people, was given to the wicked horn, together with a continued burnt offering, because of the transgression of God's people. Their abounding irreverence, ungodliness, and lack of piety and righteousness and truth were cast down to the ground, and the wicked horn, accomplished this by divine permission and prospered.
Yeah, that's very true. That is very true. But my point here is that it wasn't just because Antiochus Epiphanes was a mean, bad guy. There was a lot of mean, bad guys. Some of them even probably worse than him.
It was the fact that God allowed it.
It was not only the fact that God allowed it, he didn't just allow it, he ordained it. Because of the transgressions. If we go back again, look what we found in Isaiah. Why did all of this stuff come on Israel? Why were they taken to Babylon in the first place? Because of their transgressions. It's interesting, next time we're going to go into the 9th chapter of Daniel, and one of the reasons why the 70 weeks of Daniel, which is the progression of judgment and restoration, one of them is to finish the transgression. Okay? This is why it wasn't just the guy. We need to get this in our heads. It wasn't just the guy. It was the transgression. Because of the transgression, it took truth and stamped it in the ground. Antiochus Epiphanes was the tool. He was the guy that brought it about. But he was moved by God because of the transgression. Therefore, The transgression was what drove truth to the ground.
Okay, it had already been done by the Jews, but Antiochus Epiphanes came along and said, I might as well just do this because you did it already.
Well, no, because, in the eyes of God, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
right.
Yes, in the eyes of God, their sacrifices probably weren't meaning a whole lot at
Antiochus
this point.
made manifest what had already taken place spiritually.
That's exactly
Right,
right. Yes,
that's
thank
right.
you.
Thank you.
Very good. Yeah,
We have a clear thinker over there.
yeah, I like that. Okay, and a host was given him. In other words, he was given, and I know this can be interpreted a host of people, but more so than that, there was, I believe, a spiritual host that was given him against the daily sacrifice. Okay? In other words, there was some help. And this is not unusual. You remember God talking about Sennacherib and also about Nebuchadnezzar, but Sennacherib in particular, when Sennacherib said, look how important I am and I've done all of this, and God said, you haven't done anything. You're not a really strong guy. I just made everybody else weak.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what he said in Isaiah. Remember that? He says, it's not so much that you're such a strong guy, I just made everybody else weak. In other words, I gave power to make them weak, not necessarily power to make you strong. There's two ways to look at everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we were looking at here. This host, this spiritual influence, made them weak. So he was able to very easily take away the sacrifice and so forth. All right, verse 13. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? So here's Daniel, he's seen all of this, and all of a sudden, there is a saint speaking. Now this is probably angels that he's talking about here. In fact, we'll find out it was. The saints here, a lot of people want to make a big thing out of this. You know, this was the saints of the church, and because they entered into eternity, there were some saints that were standing there back in time looking at this who came from the church. You hear some really strange things. Saints here really means something that is in the divine area of the divine or supernatural or whatever we want to call it. In this case, they were angels. And he says, how long shall the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, okay, and the transgression of the desolation, not the transgression alone, transgression of the desolation. In other words, how long will they cease having the daily sacrifices and also this desolation of the temple, this desecration, if you will, of the temple? How long is this going to go on? And the host to be trodden underfoot. In other words, how long will the priests be trodden down so they cannot do their job? Okay, how long will they be held down? And he said unto me, now one angel asked the other one, and the angel answers by talking to Daniel. So it's clear he wanted Daniel to write this down. And he said unto me, 2,300 days, and then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. This 2,300 days is really interesting. You read, sometimes I really wonder about some of these commentators and people who write in here. You know, they go to great lengths. They divide this 2,300 into two, and then they do something else, and they figure out, because it's on a different calendar, the Chaldean calendar versus the Hebrew calendar, oh, it now means 3.5 years, 1,500 and some days or something. I look at them and I said, you guys are all nuts. It's very simple. 2,300 days, a little over 6 years, by the Hebrew calendar. Hebrew. Daniel's writing in Hebrew. It's going to be the Hebrew calendar, not the Chaldean calendar. And when you do that, you come up with 6 years and 110 days, which is interesting. Notice what's going to happen. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Yes?
And here it says that it means that the evening and morning times are the sacrifices. So would
Yes.
that be the sacrifice times, or?
No, but thank you for bringing that up. The evening and the morning, this was a Jewish way, and we see that even in creation.
Yeah.
The evening and the morning were the first day. It was a way of saying a complete 24-hour cycle.
Okay.
Versus a Hebrew day, which started in the morning and ended at sunrise and ended at sunset. Okay, so you know the morning and evening. I'm sorry, when the morning to the evening was one day. So if you were on the Sabbath, the next day started at sunset and went till. Okay, so you had this different way of looking at days, whether you're talking about Sabbath days or whether you were talking about 24-hour days. So he's being very specific here, it's 24-hour days. It also, excuse me, I'm having an allergy attack in the middle of winter. This is crazy. I'm getting over it though, thank you. This also had to do with the idea of the morning and evening sacrifice. So by putting it this way, it takes into account the fact that it was going to be morning and evening sacrifices. There was going to be 2,300 of them missed. Which, this is the importance to the religious side.
Well, and it prepped the Maccabees for when they were gonna win the battle, right?
Oh, yeah,
They just,
absolutely.
okay, well, it's right here, guys.
It's all here, yeah, you got it. You figure the days and go. All right, okay, so it's going to take 2,300 days. And then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Verse 15, and it came to pass, when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision, and sought for the meaning, that behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. One thing I want you to glean out of this scripture, if you want to know anything about scripture, or if you want to know anything about God, the only way you're going to find out is asking. Seek, ask, look for it. Daniel could have said, wow, what a vision. Whew. I think I'll go write a book. He had enough information, right? He just went off and did the book. Or he could have, I've got to go tell everybody about this. But he had to know the meaning. There was something he really needed to know about this. Now, we're looking back on it, so it's easy for us to say what it was. You know, I mean, this is pretty obvious. We have history. He didn't have that. So to him, there was a lot of stuff here he didn't understand. So he had to have that meaning. So he asked. He wanted to know what that meaning was. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Uli, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So the man that appeared before him was evidently Gabriel, the angel. And he stood before him, and then there's a voice that comes out of this land between the Uli River and says, let this man, give him the meaning, tell him what's going on. I think this is something I noticed today. I guess I thought about it, but maybe never registered. The only time you hear Gabriel mentioned by name in the Bible is when he is giving a message from God. We see him here in the 8th chapter of Daniel. We see him again when he comes to the high priest in Jerusalem and tells him, hey, the Messiah is going to be born. And then we see him again when he comes to Mary and tells Mary what's going to happen. And then we don't see him again. 3 times is all we hear of Gabriel. And yet he's probably the most well-known angel of all the angels in heaven. We all know the name Gabriel, and yet he only shows up 3 times in Scripture, and all 3 times he's bringing a divine message of something that's going to happen in the future. So it's interesting. Gabriel had some connection with God that his job had to do with future events, evidently. I'll be interested in talking to him about that one of these days. I'll have to ask him what his job is. See if he's doing it right. Verse 17. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now this is an interesting set of events here. One thing I find is really interesting was Daniel's reaction. Now, from everything we know about Daniel, he was not really a wimp. You know, he walked into the lion's den without blinking an eye. Didn't seem to me that there was too much going to bother Daniel. Daniel was up in age now, by the way. You know, he wasn't a young buck anymore. Been around a while. And he'd seen other visions. And he'd seen all those terrible beasts. And yet when Gabriel drew near, he fell down afraid. What I find is interesting is when Gabriel drew near to Mary, she just sat there and looked at him. Interesting. The reactions of the two. But to Daniel, I'll let you ponder that one. I don't know what that means, but I just threw it out there. He became afraid, he fell on his face, and notice what he says here, that Gabriel says, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now this is where a lot of people get involved and get kind of wrapped around the axle. They take the idea of the end, and they say, this is the end of time. And I made this same mistake when I first read this chapter, a few years ago. I said, oh, this is the end of time. This is back here at the end of the tribulation. This is out there at the end of time sometime. That's not what the end means here. This is talking about the end of this payment of transgression that's going on here. Remember I said this 8th chapter was set in here. It doesn't really, to me, the 8th chapter doesn't fit with what Daniel has been talking about. He's been talking about Gentile kings. He's been talking about world domination. He's been talking about, and he's going to be talking about the end of time. He's going to be talking about the end of the Gentile reign and all that. And then in here sits this 8th chapter, which deals specifically with an incident or something that happened to Jerusalem and not to the entire empire of the world. You see what I mean? This is different. This is very unique, very secluded, very selected thing here that happened. And so what he's saying is that this is going to be, this vision is going to happen at the end. At the end of what? At the end of this transgression and at the end of the Medo-Persian Empire. Notice we don't see a third beast. What happened to the other beast? We had 4 before. We knew the first one, Babylon. So we would think if he's going to pick it up with the Medes and the Persians, that he would at least have the Medes and the Persians, and then he would have the Macedonians, and then he'd have the Romans. But he doesn't go on. He stops it right there. So we're talking about the end of this transgression, which will be at the end of the Medo-Persian Empire. And we'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground. Now, that's a great reaction. He falls down scared to death and falls asleep. I could do that. I wouldn't have any problem. I could go to sleep anytime. But Daniel fell into a deep sleep. But Gabriel touched him, woke him up, and set him upright, or set him on his feet in a standing position. And he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last, notice this, in the last end of the indignation. Not the end of time, not the end of, but the end of indignation. Whose indignation?
God is getting indignated.
You got it. God's indignation for this particular thing we've been looking at. Okay? Okay. For at the time appointed, the end shall be. Now this was probably given to Daniel for a couple of things, of course, for him to know, but primarily also as we've seen in Isaiah, It was given so that there would be some encouragement to the Jews. This is not going to last forever. There's going to be an end to it. You remember God when he was prophesying about Babylon. He always said, there's going to be an end, guys. You know, you're going to go through this. Your transgressions, you're going to go through this, but there is an end in sight. So there was some encouragement to his people that says, yeah, you're going to go through this. My indignation is really stirred up. And because of the transgression, you're going to go through this, but there is an end. It's coming. It's 2,300 days after it starts. Okay? Verse 20. The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. So if there's any question about what this was, here it is. And the rough goat, or the he-goat, is the king of Grecia. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Yes.
I read an account, and it may have been in Josephus, that when Alexander the Great came through Jerusalem, the priests of the temple showed him this passage, and that he actually worshiped God there, seeing that he had been prophesied about.
That is in Josephus that covers that. And yeah, that's a possibility. And in my thinking, it's probably a probability. For a couple of 3 reasons. Number one, of course, Alexander was not the most, how do you want to put it? He thought himself pretty good. I mean, he was a son of Zeus, you know, pretty important guy. So anything that made him feel like he was really important gained your points. Okay? And of course, it was the high priest in Jerusalem. He wasn't exactly stupid, you know. So in walks Alexander. Well, if he can make some points. Hey, Almighty One, let me show you something. You're in our scriptures. Did you know you were in our scriptures? Can you show it to him? Yeah, that makes sense. But there is no historical, other than Josephus, there's no historical record of that. Of course, there's not a lot of historical record of much of anything from that period of time, really. So a lot of it we have to depend on writers like Josephus. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't happen, and it would make sense. And also, if you look at the way that the Jews were treated, I mean, under Alexander, they were treated very nicely under Alexander. You know, he left them alone, basically. So that very well could be. Okay. Verse 22. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. Interesting phrase there, but not in his power. They're not standing up with the same power that Alexander had. Alexander was a very charismatic type of person, so everybody rallied behind Alexander. You know, and just look at all of the stories. If you listen to everything about Alexander that's out there, you know, just the war, I mean, this guy, you know, he walked on water. I mean, this guy had a great personality. He was a charismatic leader. He loved everybody. And he just wanted to mash everybody together. And he was such a great and wonderful guy. When you read actual history, he was pretty bloodthirsty. Yeah, he went through and just wiped everybody out. I mean, if you want to get in his way, well, okay, but, you know, I'll wipe you out if you do. So anyway, he was very charismatic, had a lot of power in that way, but the 4 kings did not. Verse 23, and in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding, dark sentences shall stand up. Here we see, again, the transgressions, when they come to the full. And I put some notes down in here. You see Genesis 15, 16, Matthew 23, 32, 1 Thessalonians 2, 16. Talks about the cup being full. When their transgressions reached the point that God could no longer ignore them. And we saw the same thing happen in Isaiah, didn't we? When the transgressions reached the point where God could no longer ignore them, Nebuchadnezzar, come over here. I need you to do something for me. Right? And off to Babylon they went. Well, we see this same thing here. Because of their transgressions, it reached the point where the cup was full, and that's what it's talking about here. When that cup received the full measure, then it was time for God to act. And notice this, it's in the latter time of their kingdom. So it was toward the end of the Persian Empire that this king of first countenance and understanding dark sentences and so forth, what that's really talking about was he was a very sly, very devious type of an individual, and all the bios I could read on Antiochus all say the same thing. This guy was very intelligent, very, very smart, a brilliant strategist, but he had some things that got in his way, such as his anger, and he was a little nutty at times, but he was very sly. And one of the things he would do to defeat his enemies is he would walk in to the city. In fact, the first time he went into Jerusalem, he took his army in. Everything was fine. He rode in. Hi, everybody. Oh, by the way, guys, okay. And out come their swords, and they slew everybody. He was devious. That's the way he did things. Very cunning. And so that's what that's talking about here. Understanding dark sentences, that type of thing. He was cunning. He was sly. He was, you couldn't trust him. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. How many times have we seen that almost word for word? And he shall destroy wonderfully. What a term. And shall prosper and practice and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. You can almost see God saying, oh, he's going to do such a great and wonderful job for me. Well, I don't believe God was so gleeful about it, but at the same time I have to say, God probably said, yeah, he's doing my job. He's doing a good job. That's what I set him out to do. He's doing a wonderful job for me. We don't think about God. We think about God getting really mad, going to come roaring down out of heaven and strike fire on him. No, he's doing God's work. He gave Antiochus the power to go out and do that because the cup of the transgression was full and it's God's indignation. What would have been the difference if God had just opened up the heavens and struck fire down and drew them all down with fire? Results are the same. They're just as dead one way or the other, right? And yet if God had done that, we'd say, wow, it's just the indignation of God. He did it on Sodom and Gomorrah, and we think, wow, it was the holiness of God. He's just wreaking, Well, here he uses a man to do the same job for him. Same as he did with Nebuchadnezzar and Sennacherib and all these other guys. So we're just seeing this again. Verse 25. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. So here we see this guy. He's going to cause cunningness and craftiness and slyness and deceit to prosper in the land. By his own hand, he's going to do this. He's going to use peace to destroy many, come in under the banner of peace, and then just turn and destroy everybody in his path. He's going to stand up against the prince of princes. Again, who's the prince of princes? Yeah, he's going to stand up against God, basically, or the Messiah, however you want to view that particular situation. But he shall be broken without hand. He died, and it's interesting, they don't really know for sure what happened to him, but they know he died in 160 was it 162 BC, 61 BC. He died, and they tell us that whatever it was he died of, it was anguish. It took him a while to die, and he really went through it in the process of dying. And it was not by any man's hand. I fully believe God just said, okay, that's it, pulled the plug and said, you've had it. And what he died from, I don't know. But it was prophesied he was not going to die by a man's hand, and he didn't. Even though he was a man in battle all the time, and you figure, you know, most of the kings died in battle, but he did not.
All God had to do was stop that heart.
What's that?
I said, all God had to do was stop that heart.
That's all he had to do. But I think he did a little more to this guy. He made him suffer a
Made him a
while.
little sick.
Maybe he gave him cancer or something, I don't know.
Terrible.
Gave him something. Verse 26, and the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. All right, so Daniel is instructed by Gabriel that this is a true event, it's going to happen, and write it in a vision, and shut up the vision. This does not mean don't tell it. It means seal it. Seal it. So in the future, when this happens, here is a sealed copy of what I said before it ever happened.
And how far in the future is this?
This isn't really very far into the future, because remember Daniel was alive in the Medo-Persian Empire, so this probably was someplace, and I didn't look it up on the timeline, it was probably 100 years, maybe give or take.
Still significant.
Yeah, it was significant. Oh yeah, this wasn't a week, in the future. Yeah, we're still significant. In times of prophecy, though, that's a pretty narrow, pretty small time span, only 100 years. I mean, that's not much. So seal it up, and we think about, to me anyway, what I think about is Jeremiah with the scroll that we talked about in Revelation, where he's told to go buy a piece of property and take the deed, shut it up or seal it, drop it in a jar and seal it nice and tight. And when they came and destroyed the city and stuff, and he pulled out his deed and said, that land is mine. Remember that? And he said, this is what God's going to do. And of course we see that in Revelation, where nobody can open the document, the scroll of the throne, because it's sealed. The only one is the one who bought the property. And that's the Lamb that bought the property. Well, this is kind of what that same idea. We're sealing it up, and when the time comes, you can open the jar and take out the writing and say, look, this is what's going on. This is why this is happening to you. Hey, Jews, this is why it's happening. It's your transgressions.
Well, has he been speaking metaphorically about this, or is there any evidence that Daniel actually somehow sealed up his prophecy here and it was discovered later?
Well, yeah, his whole book. I mean, I don't know that he actually put it in the jar and went through that, but certainly the writings of Daniel, they're still here.
Okay.
So
I
obviously,
see
yeah,
what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, it was a matter. This is to be official document. This is my official document. That's what we're really getting to here.
There, in the verse of 26, it says here, this vision has to do with and belongs to the now distant future.
The which one?
The now distant future. So it is,
Yeah.
corroborates what you just said, rather than the distant future.
That's correct. Yeah, yeah. This was when this happens. When Antiochus Epiphanes comes around, and all this is happening. The Jews can open Daniel and say, "Look, oh look."
Mhm.
The same high priest that said to
Alexander.
Alexander, "Look," can also say, "Oh, look.
Yeah, right.
Oh, look. Why? I see why now."
Yeah.
Well, this,
And that may have been why the Maccabees came about. Judas Maccabeus. Yes.
what it says here, wherefore shut thou up the vision, it says keep it to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's King James.
Yeah, it didn't mean not to tell it to anybody. He wasn't saying in that sort of keep it to yourself. The writing, seal it up, keep it to yourself. In other words, don't lose it.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
keep track of it, keep care of it. This is important.
Yeah.
It was the writing, not his words. And if you look at the next verse, and I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. He told people. He told people, but nobody could understand it.
And
Now,
he
I don't know
couldn't
who he told.
understand
Maybe it was his friends, 3 Hebrew children. I don't think he just went off to any old buddy and say, hey, let me tell you what I found. He probably his friends and other people that were had wisdom in the scriptures, but nobody understood all the ramifications of what was going on there. I found that interesting. Also, you notice Daniel fainted and was sick certain days. One of the things that I found over the years, and I have never been privileged, really, I think I've had a few little visions or, things. But I do know people that have had visions and had a kind of, you should say, a ministry of visions. I used to have a pastor at one time, and I remember we'd be we'd be down after service, and all of a sudden you'd look up and he'd take a napkin or a hanky and he'd put it over his eyes. He'd be laying on his back. You'd think he was dead. He'd lay in a perfect hanky over his eyes. He's getting a vision. This was just one of the, I can remember that as a kid. And then he would get up and he was so weak, we'd have to help him out to the car. But he could tell us what he saw in this vision. It was interesting. He had been on the mission field and different things, so he had that mindset. But when you find things out from God and you use the power of God comes on you, it takes your physical strength. I remember I was talking to Pastor Dester a couple of Sundays ago, I guess, about some of the healing things that we both have been to a lot of camp. I've been 60 years and saved, and so I've seen a lot of these healing campaigns, people coming through, Oral Roberts and all of them. We were talking about them, and I can always remember these guys would pray for a while, but they can only pray for so long, and then they finally say, I can't go any longer. And I remember William Branham, he was a little guy, he wasn't very big, he was very slight. And I can remember him praying and praying, and pretty soon they'd come hold him up, and he'd say, I gotta pray for one more. And then they'd take him off. They'd almost drag him, and he was just completely...
But he was totally drained.
Just drained completely out. And so the power of God takes the physical out of you. But notice after certain days, I don't know how long that was, he rose up and did the king's business. That's how we kind of know he must have been on the king's business. And there's a lesson here. Even though we find things out from God, and it may be very important, and maybe Daniel felt the best thing to do was to take this message and go charging back to Babylon and get everybody together and and try to figure this thing out. As important as the message was, he understood that the spiritual side has to take second seat when we have obligations that we put ourselves under. And sometimes, we want to run off and, God's calling me to go do something. Well, if God calls you to do something, he'll take care of those situations that you placed yourself under.
Yeah.
I've always found that to be so true. When it was time for me to leave a church, leave a pastorate, leave a job in the church where I was doing a lot of different pastoral assignments. And when I felt it was time to go, and I just had a strong feeling, lo and behold, I'd lose my job. Or something would happen in the church, or something would come about. Somebody would call me and say, hey, we need you up here. And then I would sit down with the pastor, and he says, man, I just feel, yeah, you need to go there. I didn't have to just walk up and say, I'm quitting because I've got to go do the work of God. That never works with God. God always will make a way for you, but you have to be patient.
Yeah.
And if you feel God is calling you someplace, or maybe your time in this church is done and you think maybe God needs to move, is wanting you to move on, pray about it and wait. God will make a way. Somebody will call you up from another church and say, we have an opening, we really want you over here. Talk to the pastor and it'll work. If it doesn't work, it's not God.
Well, that's it. It happened with David. It took him 15 years after he was anointed to get.
Yeah.
Yeah, if anybody could have been in a hurry, it was
Yeah.
David. Hey, I'm already been anointed. What's going on here?
Yeah.
But we have to wait for God's time. And when God does things, he always does it well. Any questions? Oops, I'm 5 minutes over.
In a way, this can be a parallelism to the actual end of time.
Yes, there is a very definite parallelism there, yes. And that's why so many people get kind of wrapped around the axle with Antiochus
Because I
Epiphanes.
thought it was talking about the end of time.
Yeah, and some people, you know, they even go so far as to say, hey, Revelation's already happened, Antiochus Epiphanes was the Antichrist. Well, of course, they haven't done a whole lot of studying, because I didn't see the clouds open up and a big white horse and, you know, all this stuff happen at the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, so I don't think that's what it was. But yeah, they do parallel, and it's the short-term example or predetermined events that's going to happen in the end time. We can see this guy and we get an idea of what that character that has the spirit of Antichrist in Revelation is going to be like. Any other questions, comments? This is good.
Same with Hitler.
I don't know what to ask.
Okay.